Hello there, and welcome back to the Sleepy Disclosure Project. Tonight we begin with something almost too strange to believe. Nearly a century ago, a teenager in Ohio may have brushed against the very keys to anti-gravity, and perhaps even time itself. Long before the stories of a UFO crash at Roswell, Townsend Brown was wiring coils and foil in a basement, and what he saw moved in ways nature should never have allowed. Mainstream science would dismiss it as ion wind. But Brown insisted it was something else, something Einstein himself had never explained. To him, it was gravity bending, space flexing. The first step into a world where weight and even time might no longer obey the rules. By the late 1940s, his work carried a new name, electrogravitics. Admirers whispered of hidden doorways to propulsion without fuel, or time slipping under voltage. Critics scoffed, and yet patents vanished, files were sealed, and his name slipped from public record into the realm of secrecy, UFO lore, and the suspicion that someone, somewhere, had quietly taken his work further than he ever imagined. But before we begin, if you find yourself genuinely pulled towards stories of mystery, conspiracy, and forgotten lore, please consider subscribing. And if you truly like tonight's story, a gentle press on the like button or a friendly comment sure does go a long way to keep these journeys coming. But now let us go back to where it all began. A flickering bulb, coils humming, and a boy who may have brushed against a force that could change everything. The basement smells faintly of damp stone and ozone, the air like a thundercloud caught underground. A single bulb swings lightly on its cord, pushing shadows across shelves stacked with what most would call junk. Bits of copper coils, discarded glass tubes, and the wire guts of old radios. Against this clutter, a boy crouches with tight focus, sleeves rolled above his elbows, his hands ink-marked from hours of note-taking. His name is Thomas Townsend Brown, though at this age that name carries no weight at all. Just another restless teenager searching for something beyond textbooks. The crackle of his crude setup makes the room feel charged, the sort of space where dust itself feels alive and waiting. His workbench looks improvised but purposeful. Coil salvage from radios line up beside small glass vacuum tubes and blocks of mica pressed into odd shapes. A capacitor bulges on one corner of the bench, handmade and crude, but designed with patience. Brown leans in close, adjusting brass dials with hands that betray a faint tremble. Every adjustment rests on trial and error. Moments earlier, a thin strip of foil had lurched upward sharply, then fallen like a dead leaf, the wire tether twisting uselessly. Hours of small failures live in that basement, wires hissing, sparks snapping without reward. Yet he tries again, body motionless except for his fingers brushing the dial, steadying for another attempt. The coil hums in a low tone that makes the bulb above cut in and out. Brown freezes, hardly breathing, eyes locked on the suspended disc hanging on fine wires. This one he had shaped with more care, foil stretched tight and edges bent smooth, balanced so perfectly it ought to sway like a pendulum. Instead, something stranger occurs. The disc glides. Not a twitch, not the random flicker of static, but a smooth drift toward one side, as though pulled by a hidden hand. Dust flecks scatter in pale corona light wrapping the wires, and the still air of the basement feels shifted, as if invisible currents have begun to stir it. Brown skin pricks, hair rising on his arms, his mind caught between disbelief and hope. Brown, then, is not yet the man rumoured in conspiracy circles, nor the fringe scientist dismissed in faculty lounges. He is a young boy in the Midwest, armed with curiosity, and a family willing to supply his need for equipment. His parents had the means to support him, arranging tools and wiring that turned their property into something closer to a private workshop than a quiet home. That background mattered, because most boys of his era would have only daydreamed about experiments like these. Brown could build them, watch them sputter, and then refine them until small patterns began to repeat. What he discovers in this basement is born not from extravagance but discipline. Long stretches of patient tinkering waiting for a result he cannot yet describe. Even early on, Brown shows a peculiar stubbornness. He worries about the obvious explanations. Couldn't the disk be moving simply because air bursts are pushing against it? To test this suspicion, he even imagines placing entire setups under oil, making the environment too dense for hidden breezes to interfere. The persistent speaks. He might not know what force he is courting, but he insists on cutting away every cheaper explanation. Critics would later call it misguided. To him, it felt like rigour. And for a boy barely past high school lessons, such persistence shows not foolishness, but hunger. The suspended foil disc keeps gliding across its thin track. A metallic buzz deepens. The dim bulb sways harder, as if the room now shares the experiment's rhythm. Shadows bend back from corners, throwing Brown's wiry form against damp brick. He sees not a trick, but something purposeful. Movement where no obvious engine lives. In this atmosphere, the question takes shape. Is he watching air twist from electric sparks? Or has he nudged one of the universe's heavier forces from its constant grip? The difference seems thin, almost invisible, but to his eyes at that moment it feels nothing less than cosmic. From the charged air of that damp basement, the view tilts outward to a quieter river town. Zanesville, Ohio, 1905. Pottery kilns burn red through winter nights, and in the distance you can hear whistle blasts from freight boats travelling the Muskingum River. In the middle of that industrial landscape, a boy was born with the name Thomas Townsend Brown. Nothing about those brickyards or slow-moving steamboats suggested that one of their own would someday chase after gravity itself. His family had money, enough to cushion his curiosities. That security mattered more than anyone realised, because it meant his questions wouldn't stay idle fantasies. They could become working machines built from copper, glass and wire. Picture his hands a decade later in a cluttered room, screws scattered across pine boards, the guts of gutted radios stretched out for inspection. Clock gears trimmed and rearranged into shapes only he understood. Pencils scratched uneven diagrams into thick notebooks. Spirals of coils inked beside guesses about unseen forces. The handwriting trembled at times, not from doubt, but from the excitement of ideas outrunning the steadiness of his grip. These weren't tidy lessons from textbooks. They were fragments of something felt rather than told, arrangements of parts that seemed to breathe when a battery snapped its current. Once the air filled with a metallic scent of ozone, he felt closer to truth than school had ever promised. That restless tinkering led him eventually to mentors willing to entertain odd paths. Denison University stood a train ride from his boyhood home, and within its brick walls he found Paul Alfred Biefeld. Biefeld was Swiss, with academic roots reaching back through European universities, and acquaintances who had once stood in lecture halls with Einstein himself. For a young man from a provincial Ohio town, this was like looking from a small river into the Atlantic. Suddenly, Brown's private diagrams resonated against wider conversations about relativity and unseen dimensions of physics. Did he fully understand? Maybe not. But even to sit near someone who had crossed paths with Einstein was enough to steady his conviction. Late nights in laboratories brought sharper images than daylight classes could. Brown leaned into the glow of Crookes tubes, those early experimental glass lamps. The chalk-white light carved strict shadows across his cheekbones, and the hum of high voltage leaked faintly through the air. He watched carefully, convinced the radiation and shimmering gas trails said more than manuals allowed. To him, a discharge wasn't just a discharge, it was a message, a hint that natural law wasn't closed shut. Hours passed unnoticed, midnight bells outside his dormitory fading into the gentle sputter of tubes and the rhythm of circuits firing again and again. Academia didn't welcome him fully. Too methodical for those who dabbled in fringe claims, Too stubbornly unconventional for the smooth ladder of academic physics, Brown existed in between. That liminal posture defined him more than his machines did. He wasn't polishing equations for journal publication, nor was he ranting like the pamphlet sellers who saw conspiracies in every streetlight. He walked along both worlds without planting a firm foot in either. Some professors smiled politely but marked him as eccentric. Others admired his persistence yet warned him that voltage alone wouldn't bend the universe. But Brown, shoulders hunched over a homemade rig, continued as if their doubt was only another background noise humming behind the static. There is a small scene remembered from his student days, and it reveals the character forming in him. Brown sat at a desk, the radio dial spinning under his fingers, pulling wisps of sound out of the ether. Crackling static filled the night as he pressed closer, almost holding his breath, expecting unknown voices to slip through. Ohio air carried barn dance fiddles and commercial jingles, but he sensed more was hiding there. Within that scratch of current, he felt outer layers pressing in, unseen signals, perhaps cosmic, perhaps something stranger. His attention balanced between measured notes scrawled in a ledger and that sense of mystery which couldn't be diagrammed. That mixture of rigour and mysticism became his signature. Supporters suggest this blend allowed him to glimpse possibilities others overlooked. Skeptics counter, it was exactly this streak that led him down blind corridors. Either way, his work never cleaved cleanly to laboratory convention. Whenever he achieved something that looked like success, silence or dismissal soon followed. A demonstration would earn interest, then fade. A patent would file neatly, then vanish into military cabinets labelled with seal stamps no civilian eye could pierce. Each small upward swing arrived paired with a sagging echo, making him both notable and forgettable in the same breath. It was this pattern, repeated again and again, that later made his story irresistible to conspiracy communities. Here was an outsider genius, brimming with designs that brushed near impossible concepts, only to be pushed to margins, obscured or muffled. Every document that disappeared seemed less like routine bureaucracy and more like proof of suppression. Every silence grew thicker with meaning. It was never just a failed experiment. It was another whisper of unseen hands moving the pieces into classified vaults. For believers, Brown wasn't just a scientist. He became a cipher through which the possibility of hidden truths could be read. By the late 1920s and early 1930s, the stage of his life was clearly set. He would never fit the polished role of an Ivy League physicist with tenure, nor would he drift fully into crank territory, selling miracle devices through mail-order ads. He chose, intentionally or not, the in-between corridor, the one where theories flirt with impossibility and slowly gather legend. The result was a man perfectly suited to become myth after death, even if his daily hours were spent hunched over precise measurements and drifting sparks. Every step he took forward carved two shadows, one visible, one suppressed. Both would outlive him. When you gather these glimpses together, his childhood abundance, family support, boyhood laboratories humming, university connections to older European physics, you see less of a straight line and more of a spiral. Every lap returned near the same questions. Could electricity control gravity? Could voltage fight inertia? Could unseen laws bend with the right circuit? It was always the same search, shaping his identity even when results faltered. That spiral carried him toward moments that still provoke debate, for it was under Biefeld's influence that the curious anomaly, the so-called Biefeld-Brown effect, would take form, and with it, the first echo of the claim that electrogravitics might do more than dance bits of foil in a dusty basement. What it meant, whether illusion or discovery, would follow him the rest of his life. The room holds its breath, as though the walls themselves hesitate. Copper coils have just shut down, their heat seeping into the night air, leaving only a faint resonance echoing against concrete and wood. Ozone lingers in the back of the throat, sharp and metallic, mingling with the faint smell of singed dust that clings after prolonged strain on wires. Townsend Brown steadies his hand over brass dials, each finger trembling not from fear but from the prickling charge that seems to crawl across the skin. A disc wrapped in foil hangs by threads so thin they nearly vanish in the low light. For a moment, everything is steady, until the current surges again. The hum rises, steady, almost like the breath of some unseen presence. Across the laboratory table, his mentor's name has already begun to settle into association with these trials. Professor Paul Alfred Biefeld, born in Switzerland, carrying the weight of old European networks that brushed up against Einstein himself, had offered Brown intellectual company at Denison University. Their partnership, though unequal, would fuse forever in public memory, so much so that decades later the phenomenon would bear both their names. Yet Biefeld remained cautious, sceptical of grand interpretations. What looked to him like a curious electrical effect appeared to Brown as the key to a hidden continent of physics. That tension between cold restraint and unshaken conviction would define how history remembered them. It is late one night when the unfolding begins in earnest. The disc, suspended like a fragile ornament, pulls toward its positive side, not in the ragged jolting way of static discharge, but with an uncanny glide. Smooth, slow, deliberate. The wires do not quiver with chaotic sparks. Instead, the movement seems to slip under some deeper law. The glow of corona discharge paints the surface faintly blue, a ghostly trace of light making the edges blur. Brown's eyes widen. To him, this is no simple draft of air or everyday electrostatics. This is nature about to confess a secret, a force unaccounted for stepping in from the margins of known physics. Witnesses would later recall seeing these discs ease across their guiding wires, silent as sleepwalkers. Some shook their heads, muttering about ionized gases, familiar with the way charges drive molecules to stream like microscopic winds. Others admitted they had never seen motion so steady, so alive with intent. The clash of interpretation was immediate, even before data sheets cooled from fresh graphite marks. Brown, however, had no confusion. He named it without hesitation, electrogravitics, a direct coupling between electricity and the great weight that ties everything to Earth. He whispered of gravity itself being coaxed, nudged, perhaps redirected by voltages carefully aligned. Patents soon mapped out this vision with a fearless hand. Brown filed diagrams that spoke of saucer-shaped craft held aloft without wings or moving propellers. In his sketches, capacitors expanded to scales that could cradle passengers instead of wires and foil. His pages spoke of steering inertia itself, as though momentum could be shifted like wind in sails. The rhetoric of these documents startled some and thrilled others, yet to Brown they were practical log entries of a new physics waiting to be harnessed. He was not content to let the anomaly sit in notebooks. He wanted it airborne. He wanted it transforming life itself. Demonstrations rippled outward, small lecture halls filled with the faint crackle of corona discharge. Visitors watched as discs slid along wires in silence, unaware of the cascade of ions brushing past their own skins in unseen breezes. Oscilloscopes buzzed in the corners, their green traces vibrating with data that seemed both mundane and extraordinary. Brown, thin and sleepless, stood beside his devices like a conductor waiting for disbelief to yield to awe. The audience clapped politely, then argued afterward in corridors about what they had witnessed. For Brown, the clapping was irrelevant. The effect spoke more loudly than skepticism ever could. In his notebooks of the 1930s and 1940s, shapes emerged that would later haunt American imagination. Discs arching upward, spindly forms with plates outstretched, arrows charting improbable trajectories with captions that promised control over gravity. Some readers leafing through his archives decades later felt their breath stall. The outlines mirrored the flood of saucer sightings soon to fill newspapers and radio bulletins. It was as if his private musings had seeped forward into collective vision, technology and mythology folding over one another in eerie symmetry. His copper-wrapped boards and foil discs looked like prototypes of the future others thought came from other worlds. Still, mainstream science held the line. Critics described every thrust he measured as nothing more than ion wind. Air molecules pushed by high voltage created momentum, they argued, not gravity made pliable. Many university physicists waved dismissive hands, explaining that vacuum environments would destroy the illusion immediately. For a few years, though, rough tests abroad hinted the case might not be closed. Brown brought equipment overseas, setting up trials under controlled conditions in French laboratories. Reports emerged of results that resisted easy explanation, yet soon funding dried up and institutional attention shifted. The Montgolfier project, as it was known, left behind inconclusive paperwork and a trail of unsettled mystery. The argument lived on, unresolved. Brown clung tight to his conviction. To him, the debate missed the point entirely. If the device moved in accordance with applied charges, then something deeper was at play. He staked his life's work on the possibility that he was bending the gravitational field ever so slightly, a seed that, if cultivated, could unfurl into airships gliding without sound or rockets, transport machines hovering above dockyards, perhaps even vessels lifting free from Earth itself. He refused to rest his hope on atmospheric explanations. If anything, the criticisms only hardened his stance. In smoky auditoriums, some marvelled while others dismissed. A businessman leaning forward, his cigar smouldering unattended in a tray, a cadet scribbling his impressions onto notebook margins, struggling to match what he saw with the physics drilled into him at the academy. A professor whispering to himself about ion drift, while sneaking another look at the steady glide of the disk. Each demonstration offered not closure but more fuel for argument, and Brown seemed to feed on the turmoil. His voice quavered during speeches, not from nerves but from urgency, the certainty that the world would miss the moment if it blinked. Strange parallels hovered. In myth, ancient engineers sometimes attributed levitation to chance, magnets, or secret knowledge lost to time. Brown's capacitors fit into that lineage almost too neatly. The hummed breath of invisible fields replacing the song of priests around stone monoliths. What ancestors ascribed to gods, he attributed to aligned ions and gravity coaxed sideways. Supporters suggested that maybe ancient tales were memories of similar manipulations of environment and weight. Skeptics countered that such echoes were coincidence, human imagination overlaying patterns where physics offered none. Yet the resemblance teased at minds that stretched across eras for meaning. When diagrams of Brown's gravitators began circulating, a peculiar prophecy took shape. They resembled the descriptions of strangers in the sky spreading after the war. Metallic discs darting without sound, hovering, then shooting upward with impossible acceleration. Some whisper that Brown foresaw such craft before newspapers printed them, that he provided the human template onto which cosmic mysteries later attached. Others dismiss that connection, arguing the saucer is an archetype, a natural shape for both childhood drawings and speculative engineering. But the overlap between his notebooks and witness testimonies remains unsettling. A double image, one scientific and one folkloric, both etched by the same outlines. Even within technical archives, arguments swirled. Engineers annotated his patents with notes of skepticism, circling claims of inertial control with doubting pens. Yet those same patents disappeared into government drawers marked classified, feeding later suspicion. If there was truly nothing of value, believers argued, why bury the papers so deeply? The absence itself became evidence. Critics countered that classification often swallows even failed concepts if attached to defense contexts. The effect, however, was the same. a trail leading into shadows where resolution never returned. In the charged half-light of that original laboratory, Brown stood convinced that he had brushed the edge of something our species was barely ready to touch. To watch his foil disc move was to glimpse possibility itself sliding forward against the weight of doubt. His faith insisted that gravity might one day be harnessed like electricity before it. Yet the world's gatekeepers shifted uncomfortably, most of them declining to join him on that uncertain path. For them, it was a parlour trick swollen out of proportion. For him, it was the embryo of the future. As the night closed around his humming devices, the question stiffened in the air like static hairs rising on skin. Had Townsend Brown uncovered a key to unbinding humankind from Earth? Or had he mistaken air currents and corona discharge for something cosmic? The files and the whispers split along that line, caught between miracle and misunderstanding. The disc in his secret room kept sliding forward, an almost weightless prophet of change. And in time, those silent motions would merge with culture itself, as the saucer age broke open and eyes turned upward to match the shapes already alive in his notebooks. So the stage darkens here at Denison, coils cooling, the faint corona fading from surfaces. Brown scribbles notes under lamplight while Biefeld, still doubtful, folds his arms in quiet resignation. Outside, the world moves under skies it believes are ordinary, unaware that in a humid Ohio room, a small disk has just unsettled the very idea of gravity. The debate born there will follow Brown into conferences, rumours, and later, classified realms where quiet corridors, not open lecture halls, hold the demonstration floor. This was his watershed, a threshold crossed not with certainty but with stubbornness. The foil disc glided, and in its path stretched futures both real and imagined. Whether it was a mere ion breeze or an opening into gravity itself, history could not look away. The confusion lit fires of speculation that would ignite into the glowing myths of crafts darting across mid-century skies. From a trembling experimenter and a doubting mentor, the story had only begun. The newspaper strikes the counter with a flat smack, the headline sprawling across its front in block letters. Flying saucers seen over 9 states. A waitress in a pale dress glances at it while refilling a cup, her hand pausing mid-pour. Coffee cools as conversation drops away, replaced by a murmur stretched thin with unease. A trucker rubs calloused fingertips down a folded map, tracing routes that suddenly feel too exposed under the dome of night sky. In July 1947, the diner's neon hum and the smell of fried onions mix with the quiet tension of a world where objects glide overhead and vanish without reason. The paper doesn't offer explanation. That perhaps is what cuts deepest. Across small towns and city streets the air turns watchful. Supper concludes on shaded porches, yet meals yield to stargazing. Families lean back in wooden chairs, listening for crickets that stop too suddenly, watching for stars that shift in unnatural flight. Handmade telescopes, usually clumsy gifts for children, are pressed into urgent service. A boy in Iowa counts streaks cutting across twilight, insisting to his sister that some drift far slower than meteors, holding steady as if they are waiting. In half-lit kitchens, voices attempt calm, weighed equally between calling it imagination and fearing the alternative. At schoolyards, the talk spreads faster than chalk on blackboards. Children swap saucer cards hastily sketched on notebook paper, laughing but glancing up at the sky more often than games demand. Newspapers amplify it, radios repeat it, and within weeks every hometown conversation gnaws at one question. If they are not ours, then whose are they? The ordinary objects of life, garage roofs, clotheslines, garden fences, suddenly feel like thin walls against a force that can appear and disappear without warning. Into this charged atmosphere steps Townsend Brown, older now, shedding the image of a boy tinkering in basements. He arrives with demonstrations that feel unnervingly timed to match the skyward fever. Where others bring stories or speculation, he brings machines, foil-wrapped discs suspended on fine wires, buzzing softly until they slide with unnatural stillness from one end to the other. Those who gather in rented halls or civic auditoriums find their whispers punctuated not by the crackle of static, but by the smooth glide of brass and foil objects under glaring lights. Brown never claims aliens. Instead, he offers something different, the possibility that the mystery belongs to us. One evening in Ohio, the scene is drawn with near theatre-like precision. Wooden folding chairs fill the room, coats slung over their tops, the audience craning forward as Brown sets his simple device on stage. A foil disc shivers, steadies, and begins a slow, certain movement, guided by the invisible tension of an electrical field. It makes no sound, yet travels with conviction. Gasps cascade through the audience, some clapping instinctively, others leaning back as if distance could turn uncanny into safe. For a moment, the sources in the paper seem tethered to the floor by live wires, something demonstrable, almost domestic. Brown himself stands calm but intent, as though daring the crowd to piece together the alignment. In that role, he becomes a translator of the UFO age. Sightings described objects turning without wings, accelerating without exhaust, hovering without propellers. Brown answers with capacitors, power supplies, and simple fields. It is not extraterrestrial mystery, but human ingenuity testing its reach. The public, searching for footholds, recognizes the parallel. The lines between rumour and laboratory sketch begin to blur. Whispers circulate in local bars. Perhaps these sources, whether above Ohio fields or California deserts, are not visitors but prototypes. Perhaps someone in uniform has beaten the world to tomorrow. Academia reacts in sharp contrast. Physicists explain ion wind, the light, invisible push of electrically charged particles moving between electrodes. They insist the drift of Brown's discs is no grand secret, only a repetition of known behaviour hidden under spectacle. In journal articles and small meetings, the tone hovers between patient correction and impatient dismissal. But newspapers, hungry for the saucer wave, paint it differently. Emboldened by Brown's demonstrations, headlines describe him as the man who solved the mystery. Between classrooms and street corners, opinion fractures. Experts call him misguided. Neighbours call him brilliant. Brown's machines themselves sharpen the tension. They mirror what the public already believes they see above their farms and small towns. Aerial discs are silent. So is his model. UFOs break direction with sudden ease. His wire-strung experiments slide instantly against gravity's pull once energized. No propeller, no visible engine, only corona glow at the edges. His demonstrations replay the nation's night sky in miniature, giving form to reports most officials treat as frustration. That echo begins to build. Each laboratory demonstration feels less like an odd invention and more like a confirmation that the reporters, witnesses and families on the porch are not alone in their suspicion. The alignment grows uncanny. Reports of craft glowing in pale halos, moving without fuel, disperse through newspapers, while Brown unveils patents for field-propelled craft. One observer at a lecture whispers that the sketches resemble the same sources filling newspapers at the corner stand. Others notice how Brown's phrases, electrogravitics, inertia control, sound like translations of newspaper mysteries into physics vocabulary. Instead of debating aliens, he reshapes sightings into possible technology. Some whisper that this was strategy rather than coincidence. By grounding the supernatural in copper wires and foil, he made the story believable. In towns with UFO fever, his reputation blossoms. People with worn hands and long hours in fields come to watch, clutching tickets between fingers darkened by soil. They see in his devices what officials dismiss, the proof that someone is reaching beyond propulsion systems they recognize. For farmers who had seen strange lights drift across horizon lines, Brown's work rings truer than any skeptical article. For engineers caught between curiosity and career caution, it inspires half-secret imitation. His careful measurements, recorded in notebooks, carry enough weight to suggest invention, but ambiguous enough for critics to deny. The wider tension between secrecy and openness sharpens too. The Roswell case still sits fresh in public imagination, the Air Force retraction seen as clumsy. Pilot Kenneth Arnold's sighting before that cemented the term flying saucer in minds across the nation. Set beside those events, Brown's demonstrations feel less isolated tinkering and more like another thread pulled from the same tapestry. Some supporters suggest his inventions had started to leak from laboratories, not through accident, but because they were already in use above rural skies. Critics counter that linking him to every light or object reported risks making normal physics into self-fulfilling myth. Neither claim fades. Consider the irony. The same summer newspapers printed phrases about captured sources. Brown filed sketches for discraft of his own. Even if dismissed by academic gatekeepers, the overlap between sky sightings and basement prototypes was too close for many to ignore. And the more science denied him, the more the public poured belief into his corner. Presidents gathered advisors in closed rooms discussing unidentified aerial phenomena, while in community halls Brown received modest applause from townspeople. Two worlds, official and unofficial, entwined by faint arcs of electricity. By the early 1950s, speculation had achieved a life of its own. Conversations at hardware store counters, letters to local editors, and quiet confessions between neighbours all fed one conclusion. The sources were not all extraterrestrial. They might be American, tested under secrecy. Their unlikely properties carried into whispers through Brown's public experiments. People repeated a phrase quietly: breakthrough technology. Whether true or fantasy, it explained both the sightings and the rapid silence from officials whenever stories caught fire. Perhaps machines like Brown's carried further than basement wires allowed. Perhaps the desert sky was their proving ground. In this way, Brown's scientific curiosity merged with America's shock at 1947 headlines. What began as awkward demonstrations of capacitance became enfolded into the larger mythology of flying saucers. To his supporters, he was no longer an eccentric student of fields and coils, but the gatekeeper to humanity's most pressing mystery: how objects might turn gravity into a tool rather than a law. Even skeptics could not ignore that his inventions mapped closely onto the descriptions of unidentified craft that continued to flicker and vanish across the nation's skies. He had woven himself, intentionally or not, into the foundation of the saucer age. Roswell, Arnold's discs near Mount Rainier, accidents and balloons debated endlessly, all became cultural bedrock. Threaded among them was Townsend Brown, standing in dim halls under bare bulbs, showing silent objects glide where textbooks insist they should not. His place between myth and method meant that even decades later his claim would stretch into conspiracy. By linking blue sparks to newspaper headlines, he offered everyone a doorway between the ordinary and the extraordinary. The whispers broaden. If Brown's demonstrations echoed UFOs, then perhaps UFOs themselves echoed his laboratories. Some whisper that he was less explaining aliens than covering for secrets already underway. Classified ships tested in desert skies, their resemblance to saucers not coincidental but intended. Others dismiss the idea as collective projection, a public eager to find explanation in a time thick with Cold War anxiety. Yet the fact remains. Each report of silent, disc-like craft seemed to reinforce what his devices implied: technology without engines, propulsion without flame. The alignment was irresistible. By the time official projects began cataloguing sightings, the myth around Brown had cemented. Project Blue Book would later source and file thousands of reports, many explained, hundreds not. Still, official channels gave no nod to Brown. To those convinced of his importance, the silence spoke louder than denial. His early patents and demonstrations had merged too completely with America's fascination for them ever to separate again. He became not just a man, but a figure around which myth organised itself. And so Brown's story, once confined to the hum of an Ohio basement, now reached through every whisper of flying discs over the Midwest or streaks above western skies. His experiments had entered the bloodstream of folklore, becoming indistinguishable from the accounts of sources themselves. Whether dismissed or secretly studied, his name had taken root in the cultural ground of the UFO age. The boy watching foil move against expectation had become the man associated with one of the century's deepest questions. That transformation set the stage for a more unsettling possibility. For once governments took interest, silence began creeping into the record. Patents filed became more scarce, publications faded, and rumour suggested his work slid behind doors marked with secrecy. From public halls to classified warehouses, this is where the trail leads next. And if whispers are correct, the hum that once filled auditoriums began echoing instead through military hangars and locked laboratories, far from any curious crowd. The warehouse rests heavy in the heat of a Pearl Harbor night, 1956. Concrete underfoot, salt drifting in through the open bay doors, the faint bite of ozone clinging to the air. Fluorescent lamps hum above like mechanical insects, their light angled down toward a metallic disc fixed onto scaffolding. The machine looks out of place here, a fragile assembly of plates and wires against the backdrop of naval discipline and military order. Officers in starched uniforms stand close but keep their hands to themselves. Clipboard edges catch the glare. Fountain pens hover in readiness. They wait, saying little, as if the moment itself carries a weight greater than their voices can bear. The air feels charged enough to raise hairs along the forearm, a room on the edge of something not yet decided. This is where Townsend Brown's wandering experiments had arrived. The transition from cluttered Ohio tables to a space watched by admirals and defence staff marked the crossing into secrecy. What began as a curiosity of electrostatics had shifted into a Cold War opportunity. Here, officials saw more than sketches or strange demonstrations. They saw the possibility of craft that could rewrite the geometry of battle, machines that might lift without wings and cross borders without the telltale roar of engines. War had ended a decade earlier, but war's shadow lingered. Anything that hinted at altering the balance between nations drew eyes sharp and unblinking. Brown's devices, quiet and humming, slipped neatly into that appetite. At the centre of this turn was something whispered as Project Winter Haven. More an outline of dreams than a tested program, it promised fleets of electrogravitic aircraft powered not by fuel but by field effects. Aviation Week put the idea in print, with forecasts that made jet engines sound temporary, soon to be artefacts of an older age. Readers glimpsed headlines hinting at propulsion breakthroughs and imagined a future of gravity-controlled travel. Within boardrooms, the talk was different. Voices dropped in cautious tones, acknowledging that if Brown's claims held, whoever mastered them first would set the pace of the century. Some figures spoke as if knives already lingered behind smiles, aware of how rivals might bury the same discoveries out of sight rather than share them openly. Brown followed those expectations with his own set of showings. The demonstrations lost their basement improvisation. Now the tables gleamed with lab coatings, the wires shielded, the oscilloscopes steady in their glow. He tuned the voltage carefully, and once again the thin plates stirred in their uncanny drift. That blue corona emerged like a veil, clinging to metal edges, silent but visible to every watching eye. Reports note officers standing motionless, lips pressed, but pens scratching down the time and distances, the word confidential. Printed across sheets gave the atmosphere its own punctuation, reminding all that no matter their opinions, the discussion would not carry beyond thick walls. In those chambers, the question was not whether they witnessed movement, but whether its cause could truly touch the fabric of gravity or simply nudge restless particles of air. the contradiction unfolded almost in real time. Outside those walls, the public lit with excitement. Aviation periodicals dared to cover anti-gravity as though it were the next jet age. At conferences, engineers speculated aloud about commercial transport gliding soundlessly above highways, about orbital ventures requiring neither rockets nor booster stages. Yet just as quickly, the tone shifted. Magazines withdrew their predictions. Conference agendas stopped listing gravity control research. Those who once spoke eagerly now muttered about teething issues and practical limits. The silence did not creep. It descended suddenly, as if a collective decision had been made to pull curtains tight. Brown's patents, some already filed, disappeared into vaults, marked with classifications few could open. His public voice, once steady in interviews and guest lectures, faded with each year that passed. Meanwhile, within industry corridors, the lights continued to burn long past 9 o'clock. Lockheed's laboratories commanded teams of engineers who asked questions startlingly close to Brown's phrasing. Glenn Martin Company, Douglas Aircraft and others pursued variations of field-propelled devices. For those fortunate enough to glimpse internal memos, sketches of disks lined the pages beside calculations about voltage gradients and dielectric materials. Supporters suggest this period was nothing less than a cooperative gold rush, with aerospace titans testing on their benches what Brown had once balanced in his damp basement. Critics counter that momentum within these corporations rarely depended on one eccentric inventor, that engineers examined electrogravitics precisely to rule it out. Yet the timing created its own trail of echoes, too parallel to ignore. The pattern of disappearance repeated with unnerving consistency. Conversations documented in trade journals one month would be absent the next. Aviation Week, bold in proclaiming field propulsion as imminent, later retracted its visions with no satisfactory reason. Those expecting follow-ups met empty pages, replaced by safer topics of jets and rocketry. Conference papers shifted their attention toward aerodynamics, as if gravity control had never been part of the agenda. Some engineers found themselves reassigned overnight to projects with identities shielded under numerical codes. Colleagues asked no further questions because in industry settings during the Cold War, curiosity after sudden transfers became its own form of risk. Silence sat heavier than most explanations could carry. To understand this pattern, you have to place it against the atmosphere of the Cold War. Every promising advance lived under suspicion that it could alter the global balance. The United States and the Soviet Union competed not only for missile counts, but also for visions of physics reimagined. Programs crawled under layers of classifications, one stamp leading to another, until whole projects disappeared into budgets unseen, even by most lawmakers. A process described by those involved relied on need to know, words that cut conversations before they took form. Technologies that flickered with potential were easiest to hide, because few outside a small circle could explain them clearly. Brown's work fulfilled that condition perfectly. So ambiguous it could be dismissed in public, yet so unusual it could warrant further secret study. This duality left Brown's fate an open question. Had his devices truly impressed officials enough to warrant sustained classified programs? Or had curiosity given way to frustration, and the classified stamps merely concealed dead ends no longer worth public discussion? Documents that might clarify were folded into secure vaults. By design, their absence created its own aura. Those still watching saw deeper confirmation in vanishing evidence. Skeptics argued the opposite, that nothing lasting was hidden because nothing extraordinary had worked. The truth, perhaps, never left those locked drawers. Consider the image once more, a warehouse chamber drained of sound after equipment powers down. The faint brightness of corona discharge has disappeared, leaving only shadows stretched under electric lamps. Uniformed men file out, their shoes ringing against metal grates, leaving behind a device that seems suddenly too small for the expectations heaped upon it. Papers are placed into folders marked in capital letters, sealed by signatures none of us will see. Outside those doors, the world reads newsprint accounts of aerospace futures already promised. Inside, decisions are being made that will determine whether such futures flourish or dissolve into rumour. The next years show the consequences. Brown, once central in these rooms, appeared less frequently, sometimes absent altogether. Corporate investment trailed off in ways that never matched the bold promises issued earlier. Yet echoes linger. Supporters whisper that even as doors closed publicly, research paths diverged into classified wings of aerospace work, possibly inspiring shades of later technology. The stealth bomber with its discussions of electrostatic effects, the triangular testcraft sighted in desert skies under rumours of propulsion outside normal engines. Critics counter with equal weight, calling the continued association little more than myth stretching across decades. What remains constant is the opaque character of what unfolded after 1956. In that steady ambiguity, the larger culture turned to story-making. Internally, governments carried studies with names that rarely appeared outside sealed files, from Project Sign to Project Blue Book, aimed at encounters and sightings already drawing public fascination. Brown's work, though never declared as the foundation of these programs, touched their margins. UFO sightings multiplied in the very years his patents quieted, creating a shadow where speculation flourished. To some, this coincidence meant the US military had simply transferred his experiments into test flights hidden from public view. To others, it revealed only how public imagination fills voids when official records fall silent. Behind the speculation, one repeated theme remains anchored in testimony: the strangeness of watching thin plates move without obvious cause. Whether such movement belonged to gravity itself or ion currents is a scientific detail, yet it carried a resonance greater than either option. For officers accustomed to engines and combustion, for engineers schooled on aerodynamics, a device humming under quiet voltage suggested paths unexplored. That possibility was both alluring and dangerous, reasons enough for it to be folded behind multiple veils of secrecy, regardless of its ultimate merit. The warehouse environment itself amplifies this lesson. Against the openness of airbases and public air shows, the shaded interior of a Navy site imposed control. Decisions about visibility or silence were never only about science, they were about perception, rivalry, and strategic calculus. A technology that only partly works could be framed as failure for public audiences, while still being pursued quietly in case it matured. In the chessboard of Cold War advances, even scraps of unusual physics were considered too precious to discard outright. Brown's work became one such piece, moved between hands, its true value suspected but never revealed. From this vantage, the contradiction becomes less about his personal genius or error, and more about systemic behaviour. The Cold War classified what it could not fully trust. Secrecy turned ambiguity into policy. What looks to us like disappearance may have felt to them like caution, a choice to reserve unusual ideas where oversight and denial were both possible. If so, Brown's passage from public inventor to shadowed figure was less a judgment on him than a symptom of the age itself. Others see in this vanishing act the clearest signal that the discoveries were too valuable to risk at all, leaving him half forgotten by history, but absorbed into the mechanics of hidden progress. Think of the lights dimming in that warehouse. The metallic disc waits on its frame, unattended, the echo of feet fading into distance. Outside, the ocean air grows cooler, carrying with it no hint of what transpired inside. Among those who left, some carried pages that would guide their reports. Others carried impressions filed only in memory. What followed remained beyond the view of neighbours reading next day's paper. They could not know whether they were witnessing the quiet burial of a fantasy or the first concealment of a revolution. And perhaps, in that not knowing, the larger mystery took shape. What technologies, born in basements or warehouses, continue forward in shadows, while the rest of us drift among promises that never quite materialise. April 1945 fills the air with the clatter of boots and the groan of collapsing walls. Across Europe, Nazi Germany buckles in on itself, its concrete skeletons cracking under fire. Historical images often focus on flags raised or prisoners freed, but in the ashes there is another layer of urgency. Men in long coats combing through smoking laboratories, rifling drawers, hauling crates of documents. The victors are not only battling for land and surrender treaties, they are scavenging for brains, blueprints and machines before the Soviets draw near. Dust and smoke blend, making every captured chamber smell of burnt chemicals. American officers, some scarcely older than students, herd dazed German scientists into trucks as if collecting cattle. Nothing left to barter but their knowledge. That was the beginning of what we came to know as Operation Paperclip, though its true form was nothing like the neat title suggests. Operation Paperclip was a quiet hunt dressed in official grey clothing. Its task was not to put criminals on trial, but to make them vanish across oceans where their expertise could be remade into weapons of the future. Blueprints of rockets, research on toxins, fragments of atomic notes. Everything went into crates stamped in English, lifted onto aircraft that rattled their wings against cold sky. Men once sworn to a collapsing Reich were moved into neat suburban houses across the Midwest, their past scrubbed with careful paperwork, their families trailing behind onto American lawns. The effort was framed as necessity. If the Soviets reached them first, the balance of the coming world might tilt. Whether it was pragmatism or a quiet pact with frightening compromises, the urgency was the same. Out of that urgency also came stories that never made it into official files, but passed quietly mouth to ear. Among the whispered claims was one of a weapon, or perhaps more accurately a machine, called Die Glock. The bell, wide at its base, with walls that curved like the shape of a church instrument, but built of metal, several meters high, humming with menace. Some whom history caught only in fragments claimed it was fed by a glowing liquid called Zerum 525, a substance that shimmered like molten purple mercury. They described noises like bees trapped in warehoused walls, a light that stung the eyes and left the skin prickling as if touched by radiation. Test chambers lined with thick concrete offered little safety. Reports, uncertain, impossible to fully verify, tell of guards watching as birds dropped dead in mid-flight when the machine activated, while test animals crumpled in cages with no wound visible. Later retellings even insisted human prisoners collapsed in its field, unmarked yet lifeless. Details blur as any half-hidden tale does, striped across decades of rumour and speculation. Still, what remains consistent is its effect. Fields that bent movement without contact, a device heavy yet producing forces that made objects sway or twist, as if gravity itself changed its tune. Supporters suggest this strange bell was Germany's own brush against the dream of anti-gravity, pursued beneath stone foundations in Silesia, while the Allies pushed across ruined bridges. Critics counter that these accounts bear fingerprints of after-war exaggeration, part of a long tradition of cloaking an enemy in myths to inflate its menace. Yet the symmetry between Brown's experiments in Ohio and the whispered bell across the ocean remains a haunting coincidence. Both involved high voltage, corona discharge, objects gliding without obvious cause. Two worlds apart, one fueled by a teenager's striking curiosity, the other by a regime's desperation to conjure miracle weapons. Close your eyes and picture the mine shafts in Lower Silesia. A cavern deep in earth, cold damp clinging to skin, walls sweating moisture that drips in rhythmic taps. SS officers stand rigid in long coats, their eyes fixed on cables running against stone. Prison workers murmur under their breath, avoiding glances yet stealing momentary looks at a bulky object anchored by struts, its surface alive with faint violet aura. When the device activates, the air changes, iron on the tongue, a pressure behind the eyes, birds outside falling from trees. Guards note it with blank stares, scribbling. No one confesses fear out loud, but everyone feels it. This is where Die Glock rose from rumour into unsettling myth. Far across the ocean, the same year, Townsend Brown's Ohio workspace held none of that terror, only his silence broken by the buzz of electricity. His brass dials caught the glow of a single bulb, his foil discs trembled upward on wires. The hum in the room sounded no less strange, though it came not from command but from curiosity. For him, the effect was not about coercion or empire, but about nature whispering a secret just past the reach of explanation. Yet, if you pull both images together, the purple light bathing stone walls in Europe and a small disc nudging against gravity's pull in an American basement, the mirror is difficult not to see. After Germany's surrender, much of what was seized disappeared into files, labelled with bland words like restricted or classified. Some whisper those documents contained more than rockets and engines, that outlines of Die Glock sat inside dark drawers in Washington and Moscow. Whether one believes the bell existed in functional form or not, the idea of it seeded stories that would never fade. By then the Cold War's stage was lit, and every scrap of technology that hinted at an edge over the other superpower became priceless. If a machine could alter gravity, or hint at manipulating time, as some theorists later speculated, the race was not simply for skies or space, but for the very structure of reality. Operation Paperclip is often remembered for rockets, especially the V2 blueprints that grew into the Saturn program. Wernher von Braun's name circles the headlines, a man shifting easily from designing terrifying weapons to Apollo celebrations. Yet behind the spotlight, stranger fragments may have moved as quietly. Some of the same shadowed corridors that funneled German scientists into American projects also watched Brown's applications. Here is the tension. Brown's work predates this Cold War scramble, yet its later development ran alongside the military's scavenging through Nazi science. On one side, classified vaults, filling with patents pulled from devastated Europe. On the other, an Ohio inventor pushing voltage higher, sketching saucer-styled craft in notebooks. The possible intersection is never written down clearly, but lingers just beneath official silence. This larger picture gives Brown a new placement. He wasn't an isolated dreamer standing alone, but part of a flickering pattern stretching wider than borders. The US and the Soviet Union, both rising from the ruin of war, eyed gravity like hunters eyeing prey that could tip control of the Earth itself. In such a global contest, ideology mattered less than possession. A communist engineer or a capitalist tinkerer, it hardly mattered so long as one could bend the invisible pulls that anchor us to the ground. For the world's powers, rockets and nuclear bombs were only one layer, the visible teeth. The whispered promise of anti-gravity sat in another layer, half hidden but possibly world-altering. Some observers note that peculiar stone structures outside the Wenceslas mine, nicknamed the Henge, might have held the bell during its testing. The resemblance to Stonehenge is surface only, just a ring of reinforced concrete with no clear purpose. Yet the circle stands, hinting at something once anchored there. People in nearby villages recalled violet light curling above the woods, blue haze drifting at night, livestock falling ill. Whether memory sharpened with retelling or genuine witness accounts, we cannot say. Still the parallels echo. Brown seeing dust swirl around a levitating foil, villagers seeing haze drift above abandoned woods. Both left impressions vivid enough to trail across decades. At its core rests an uncomfortable question. If Nazi scientists had leaned against the doorway of gravity control before their bunkers fell quiet, and if simultaneously Brown was turning the same handle in his own way, what did that mean for the Cold War stakes? Was the real race not about missiles piercing atmosphere, but about entire paradigms opening? If the Soviets captured some fraction of this research and Americans absorbed another, then the contest might have spanned hidden laboratories invisible to history books. Records that tell of steel production and tank counts conceal another tally. Prototype devices humming in guarded rooms, guarded more zealously than gold. Brown then surfaces not as a lone eccentric, but as one participant, perhaps unwilling, perhaps unnoticed at the time, in this global current. His early notebooks sit like threads woven into a larger tapestry, some woven in Ohio, others pulled from rubble in Silesia, converging in Washington and Moscow archives. Whether or not D. Glock worked as claimed, its image shaped expectations of what hidden science might attempt. Brown gave it a mirror, his own devices animating similar dreams, and in the Cold War those dreams were currency. The collapse of 1945 ended a nightmare for millions. Yet in ending one nightmare, it may have opened a corridor for new uncertainties. Paperclip brought scientists whose records would never be fully clean into suburban neighbourhoods, teaching classes, walking streets, even as their hidden work threaded into American defence. Brown watched silently from his angle, following equations down passages that overlapped with theirs, and here the pattern tilts. Not territory, not flags, but mastery of nature's binding forces. The war ended, yet the race for impossible physics had only just begun. It leaves us with a thought that sits uneasily. Brown's experiments, small and forgotten perhaps, may have formed part of something immense, an international hunt for the ultimate edge. Peace and surrender were only the surface, while beneath, the fire smouldered into a colder but no less dangerous pursuit. The year is 1955, and the air inside a polished boardroom feels heavier than it should. Cigarette smoke curls toward the fluorescent lights, staining the ceiling with a dim haze that seems to trap the sound of voices. Around a long table of mahogany, men in dark suits slide sheets of paper back and forth, each diagram more outlandish than the last. Discs without wings, fuselages shaped more like saucers than planes, arrows charting vectors that ignore drag and gravity alike. The papers are not idle drawings. They are patent filings, contracts waiting for signatures, and in the eyes of the men who study them, reflected glimmers of a fortune large enough to redraw the future of flight. Townsend Brown's curious little machines, once hidden in damp basements, now sit replicated in these schematics, like seeds about to be planted across an entire industry. The executives here represent some of the titans of aerospace: Douglas Aircraft, the Glenn L. Martin Company, Lockheed. Companies that built the warplanes of the Second World War now sketch machines that seem closer to the reports of unidentified discs filling the morning papers than anything their engineers once carved in aluminum. Engineers in the back rooms draft designs that look more science fiction than aeronautical, yet serious men with government ties initial each page. Some whisper they are already considering production hangars where these contraptions will hum under high voltage, each prototype a promise that Brown's electric winds have matured into a corporate gold rush. It is not fringe anymore. Quietly, electrogravitics has moved into the portfolios of America's largest contractors. The signal moment arrives with a magazine cover. Aviation Week, the industry's respected trade journal, runs bold predictions that jet engines, the crown jewel of post-war aviation, may be doomed to irrelevance. Within 10 years, the article suggests anti-gravity propulsion could replace them entirely. The words send a tremor through circles from Washington to Southern California. Military contacts lean closer. Executives whisper about contracts that might shift billions if the prediction plays out. Engineers in uniforms laugh nervously, their pencils biting down harder on drafting paper. Reading the piece in a diner or on a base, one could almost believe they were already behind, that the future had slipped into some classified hangar with a locked door. And in some ways, perhaps it had. Inside corporate memos, the language begins to tilt. Passenger aircraft that hover without wings, cargo planes that can set down on a dime, no runway required, test hangars where prototype discs crackle with static under the buzz of fluorescent lights. In these private documents, engineers scribble notes like, "If this scales, we won't need wings anymore." That phrase, muttered in seriousness at the edge of diagrams, captures the fever of the moment. A world where the architecture of flight, bound for half a century to Bernoulli and lift, might suddenly be thrown aside by invisible forces tugged from charged capacitors. Supporters suggest the atmosphere in those hangars must have fizzed with expectation, like a storm about to break. Critics even then countered that it was wishful interpretation of flawed experiments, but the paper trails reveal something harder to dismiss: multinational firms taking the ideas seriously enough to burn money on them. The escalation is not just conceptual, it appears with new technical language in filings and reports. Patents reference control of inertia, as though momentum itself could be tamed by electrical gradients. Staff briefings circulate titles such as electrogravitics systems, an explanation of electrostatic motion. The phrasing is clinical, but the drawings beneath are anything but ordinary. Arrows sweep across diagrams showing craft that ignore the aerodynamic logic of airplane design. No intakes, no turbines, barely anything you would call a wing. Instead, wire lattices, disc outlines, and capacitor stacks pulse across the pages, pulling Brown's childhood sketches into grown-up ink. To read them today is to glimpse how fully the industry seemed to embrace the idea that gravity itself might yield to clever engineering. Meanwhile, money follows vision. Venture capitalists, still a new breed in the mid-1950s, circle Brown's disciples with promises of investment. Defense officials slip quietly into private demonstrations. In hotel basements and corporate labs, discs hum lightly across taut wires, surrounded by men who scribble notes in the margins, while others cross their arms in studied doubt. The scientific establishment remains split. University physicists frown at data they claim misread simple ion effects, yet whispers grow inside boardrooms that ignoring the technology could mean falling behind in a race no one publicly admits exists. The effect is something like standing halfway across a bridge. You cannot be sure the next step will hold, but you can feel the weight of expectation pushing forward. Townsend Brown, once dismissed as an amateur with strange ideas, watches his vision materialize larger than he could have built alone. He imagines silent passenger aircraft rolling through airport hangars without any jet exhaust, floating at waist level before sliding forward. He pictures freight vehicles gliding over highways, pausing above towns to lower containers with perfect precision. To many outside his rooms, such thoughts sound like science fantasy. But at this moment, within these boardrooms, diagrams and patents suggest otherwise. Brown had invited electricity to tug at gravity, and the largest aerospace firms in America were hedging their futures on the chance he was right. Yet the more interest grew, the more secrecy seemed to tighten its grip. Meetings shifted behind closed doors. Non-disclosure agreements appeared with the same regularity as memos. Executives screened prototype footage not for press releases but for trusted eyes only. The reels slid into safes once the meetings adjourned. Engineers who once joked about lifting sources now stopped talking at all. Something was happening in those hangars, but the public was not to be told, not yet. The fever that had begun with magazine covers and bold speeches refocused into a silence that wrapped the laboratories like gauze. Supporters later speculated this was the very moment when the industry realised its ideas had military gravity too heavy for public conferences. It is tempting to mark this period as the instant where fringe became mainstream, because in the span of just a few years, concepts that once flickered in a teenager's basement had been hosted in corporate boardrooms, tested under multi-million-dollar budgets, and printed in respected industry publications. Brown's anomaly was now a line item in federal contracts. The distance between amateur experiment and institutional research had collapsed, drawing him into the same orbit as defense contractors that would craft spy planes, missiles, and satellites. Whether he fully recognized the scale or not, his idea had escaped him. Others now carried it forward. But just as the frenzy reached its height, a peculiar shift entered the story. Aviation Week, the same magazine that fueled the fever, began to quiet its predictions. Promises that jet engines would be obsolete within a decade suddenly went unmentioned. Reports dried up. Company representatives, once eager to discuss radical prototypes, now declined comment. Classified programs absorbed patents that simply vanished from public discourse. It was as though a curtain had descended at the exact moment when momentum peaked, leaving the question of whether anything was achieved hanging in uncertainty. Some would later argue the work failed and was quietly abandoned. Others believed success had been real enough to vanish into black budgets, beyond public eyes. The executives in that smoke-filled boardroom undoubtedly understood what rode on their decisions. For some, it was a gamble on revolutionary engineering, one breakthrough away from dominating an industry. For others, it was a strategic hedge. Better to invest and discover failure themselves than ignore an avenue and learn, too late, that rivals had cracked it instead. But for those who watched designs shift from paper to classified vaults, the impression was unmistakable. Something that once flirted with newsstands had, almost overnight, become restricted knowledge. And in the Cold War climate of the 1950s, restricted knowledge was itself power. What lingers after is the texture of absence. Prototype hangars cleared, diagrams locked away, conferences rerouted towards safer subjects. Brown himself carried on, filing additional patents, speaking softly about visions others now avoided in public. Yet beneath that silence sits the unmistakable trace of a rush. Companies that had once shaped modern warfare turning their focus to forces we still do not formally acknowledge in aeronautics today. The corporate pursuit of electrogravitics may have lasted only a handful of years in the open, but within that window, the transformation from eccentric experiment to billion-dollar blueprint was undeniable. So picture again that fluorescent boardroom of 1955, contracts spread across a mahogany table, air thick with smoke and expectation. Every man in that room is trying to glimpse the same thing. A horizon where wings dissolve, where electricity tugs against the most stubborn force we know, where profits rise with craft that float on silent fields. They believe they're standing at the dawn of a new aviation, one that may leave turbines and combustion as relics. For a handful of years, even the sober voices of industrial America entertained that dream. And then, just as quickly, those voices fell quiet. The gold rush did not end in triumph, nor in public failure. It ended in hush. Corporate anticipation turned into corporate silence, a winter settling over promises that had once burned so brightly. Whether the dream perished or was transplanted into hidden programs, the result for the public was the same. Nothing to see, nothing to hear, only scattered patents and fading headlines. And in that quiet lies the greater mystery. Why an entire industry marched into Brown's vision with such intensity, only to disappear behind doors that families eating breakfast could never open. The gold rush had found its seams, but whether they ran dry or were mined in secret is a question that lingers, waiting for history to thaw. The smell comes first. Ozone, heavy as syrup, clinging in the back of the throat. Concrete walls sweat with damp, and above them the dull glow of green oscilloscopes sketches eerie shadows across the metal benches. It is 1952 inside a Navy laboratory, and sailors hover at the edges of the room, their caps tucked under their arms. They whisper among themselves, low voices about ships disappearing, about experiments that bend more than the rules of physics. The air buzzes, the wires vibrate, and each man present feels that particular sensation of standing near something they are not supposed to witness. At the centre of this atmosphere, Townsend Brown adjusts another dial, his thin fingers steady but his face drawn. The device before him isn't large, only a rigged set of capacitors, coils, and exposed plates faintly glowing blue. It hums in rhythm with the oscilloscopes, lines tracing movements that the textbooks can only describe as anomalies. For some at the back of the room, it looks like nothing more than electrons skipping through air. For others, the demonstration plays like a rehearsal of larger dreams where steel ships blink in and out of existence under silent fields of force. And in this gap between explanation and imagination, Brown's story takes its sharpest turn. Up to this point, electrogravitics had mostly been framed as propulsion, a way to push craft forward without wings or propellers. Now, Brown begins speaking in different terms. High-voltage capacitors, according to him, don't just push against gravity, they pressure the scaffolding of reality itself. Some accounts of his 1950s work reference plans that mention temporal distortions and inertial control. Even the phrasing carries the air of something moving beyond engineering. Supporters suggest Brown had realised that his effect was not about thrust alone, but about twisting the invisible weave that carries both time and mass. Critics counter it was only the drift of language, a scientist choosing dramatic words in an age that worships science fiction covers at the newsstand. The truth perhaps balances somewhere between those poles. Picture a lecture hall mid-decade. The seats filled with students, officers, visiting engineers in stiff jackets. Brown stands at a board, chalk squealing as he sketches electrogravitic fields. The diagrams show curves bending, spirals folding inward, parallels that refuse to stay straight. His voice drops as he explains that electrical stress at sufficient intensities could bend far more than motion. It could tug at reality's beams the way a storm pulls at telephone wires. Audience members exchange subdued glances, impressed or unconvinced or maybe a little frightened. And in these quiet rooms, ideas of causality and time begin attaching themselves to hardware that, only years before, had been little more than a boy's basement trick. From that moment, the overlap with older myths becomes difficult to unwind. Conspiracy writers would later place Brown's footprints on the edge of the Philadelphia experiment. The tale of the USS Eldridge in 1943, vanishing from a dockyard, reappearing in open water, sailors fused into bulkheads or driven mad by scenes outside time. The story, fragile as smoke, swelled through rumour chains and radio shows until it hardened into one of the great post-war legends. Some whisper that Brown's electrogravitics made it possible, even though official timelines show he had already stepped away from the Navy. Perhaps mere coincidence. Perhaps a necessary detail to preserve the secret. The archive offers no clear answer. As these rumours grew, new tales layered themselves on top. The Montauk Project, whispered decades later, became a story about time tunnels carved into Long Island sand. Alleged control rooms sat hidden beneath radar dishes, staffed by technicians using field devices drawing directly from Brown's theoretical framework. The story expanded to include dimensional gateways, human experiments, even manipulation of thought. Strange, improbable, yet always tied back with thin threads to capacitors, high voltages, and the conviction that electricity could command reality's deeper order. Skeptics dismiss this as myth-making, but believers recite it as if Brown's prose were blueprints guiding them through impossible corridors. There is a fragment from Brown's correspondence passed around among those who study his life with near-religious devotion. He once wrote, "The capacitors affect more than movement. They alter the very nature of cause and effect. Whether authentic or the product of later invention, the words ring like scripture among his followers. To interpret a machine that way was to suggest not merely travel through space, but a revolution in the condition that allows events to follow one another. If thrust could be bent into time, then why not the possibility of stepping outside hours, of moving backward, or slipping past continuity altogether? Inside classified demonstrations, the tension intensified. Officers with thick folders took notes while Brown's devices lit with blue haze. The room held no triumphant applause, only ambient unease. Later annotations from military scribes referred to temporal anomalies or reality disturbance fields. Whether these were intentional descriptions or simply exaggerated margins, the words deepened speculation. Imagine being a junior sailor, stationed at the back of such a meeting, listening to murmurs that ships were fading into thin air. Those scribbles, verifiable or not, carried weight because they implied that somebody in authority imagined effects stretching beyond propulsion. Brown's gradual transformation in the law owes much to this period. He began as a basement dreamer of flight, pushing discs along fine wires. By the height of the Cold War, he was branded in the conspiracy world as an architect of time machines, of teleporting vessels, of secret doorways broken open by voltage. Once tied to this mythology, his name could never escape. Every tale of a vanished craft seemed to have his ghost behind it. Some researchers point to the neat timing, how his theories about inertial control match the rise of cultural fascination with crossing into forbidden dimensions. Others dismiss it as a cultural echo, nothing more. Yet, whether one interprets it as myth-making or hidden history, the effect on Brown's reputation was the same. Consider the world of the mid-20th century. Science fiction pulp sold millions of copies. The atomic bomb had redefined what technology could inflict overnight. Rockets whispered of space travel and rumours of UFOs-filled diner conversations. Brown's language about fields bending time fell onto an audience primed to merge fact and possibility. Words like temporal distortion suited the climate, and his devices already looked like fragments from the stories printed on newsstands. A disk glowing with corona discharge could easily migrate, in imagination, to a craft stepping through the walls of reality. Against that cultural backdrop, even minor misstatements became scaffolding for enduring myths. Meanwhile, counternotes arose. Scientists tested asymmetric capacitors in controlled rooms and concluded the force was no more mysterious than ionized air pushing neutrals aside. They logged the measurements, sorted them into tidy graphs, and moved on. Yet those findings never quelled the tide. Where the lab saw ion wind, others saw cloak fields pulling at the skeleton of time. When silence followed official demonstrations, it only fed suspicions. The record falls silent, and the gaps themselves grow noisy with invention. By the end of the 1950s, his name had already become intertwined with darker whispers. Supporters suggest his deliberate misdirection of colleagues, the so-called wounded prairie chicken routine, hid the real implications of his devices after espionage had threatened them. If that trick was real, then the line between his true discoveries and his staged failures blurred beyond repair. What remained was a fog within which anything could be mapped. Teleportation, reality bending, or the bending of minutes themselves. Once placed inside that fog, Brown could never be pulled free. Each generation after layered its own expectations onto him. In the 1970s, the tales widened to include government bases tunnelling through time. By the 1980s, radio hosts placed him at the centre of control over dimensions themselves. Today, his capacitors appear on hobbyist websites, filmed hovering above tables, their faint glow framed as evidence of hidden timelines. The fact that most can be explained as electrical breeze matters less than the belief that something deeper was concealed long ago. The hunger for portals, ships vanishing, and men expunged from their place in clockwork history finds its hero in Townsend Brown. So the sailors of 1952 whisper in the dim, watching blue corona lights scatter against concrete walls. Their words drift toward rumours that still circle 70 years later. Brown, once an obscure tinkerer, is recast in the shadows as the man who brushed against time itself. Whether that brush was real, or simply an invention born of Cold War tension, remains an unsettled question. But the idea has endured, attaching itself to every story of vanished ships and hidden laboratories since. And now, with his name bound to tales of both propulsion and chronology, we step into the next corridor of uncertainty, the quiet turning of files into vaults, where even the possibility of answers is locked away. The room smells of varnished wood and stale smoke. Mahogany shines faintly under buzzing fluorescent tubes, while a circle of men in suits shift in their seats. In the centre of the table lies a stack of patent diagrams, their edges curling upward from too much handling. Without raising his voice, An executive slides one folder away from the pile. Its cover bears a single word stamped in heavy ink: classified. A secretary watches from the doorway, her pencil poised above a clipboard, as the folder vanishes into a leather briefcase that will be escorted out under the guard. At that moment in 1958, the exuberant promises of electrogravitics, aircraft without wings, propulsion defying Newton, end not with a public breakthrough, but with filing cabinets swallowing what once filled headlines. The hum of ambition lingers under the harsh lights, then fades like smoke leaking through ceiling tiles. Only a few years earlier, newspapers brimmed with excitement about gravity control. Aviation Week had gone so far as to predict that within a decade jet engines might be obsolete. Readers imagined passenger craft drifting upward from city rooftops, silent discs replacing propellers and wings. Then, almost overnight, the conversation evaporated. Aviation Week retracted its forecast. Trade journals turned the page without explanation. Companies like Lockheed, Douglas and Martin, the same giants that had sketched saucer-like craft and filed patents echoing Brown's designs, stopped speaking about electrogravitics in public. The sudden shutdown carried the neat precision of choreography, as though every dancer had rehearsed the same step of withdrawal. And what of Brown himself? The man who once filled auditoriums with foils that glided under invisible forces became a quieter figure. His letters grew sparse, his once optimistic tone shortened into practical notes, and the offers for public demonstrations ceased. Instead, he sat alone at small workbenches, sometimes in government labs, sometimes in makeshift basements, still tinkering, still convinced, but increasingly outside the spotlight. Believers recall him hunched over brass dials, his devices humming to empty chairs. To them, this image only confirms the pattern of vanishing acts that defined the late 1950s. The public teacher dwindled, replaced by a solitary man whose correspondence reached fewer and fewer hands. The disappearance left fingerprints. Navy clerks slid papers into drawers marked secret, stamping forms with confidence but never with public notice. Corporate engineers cleared their desks of electrogravitic schematics. Entire teams reassigned to projects with familiar acronyms and safer explanations. One day, reports were mailed across departments. The next, those reports no longer existed. Laboratories that buzzed with high voltage grew quiet. Even conference programs once filled with talks on gravity control were stripped down to the safer soil of aerodynamics, where graduate students could build careers without evoking ridicule or suspicion. The fade looked seamless, yet unnatural in its timing. Was the hush evidence of failure, or of success hidden away? Critics dismissed the field as little more than enthusiasm built upon misunderstood ion winds, an error unmasked once the science caught up. Supporters suggest the opposite, that the silence itself is the final proof. If the technology were irrelevant, why restrict the patents? If it amounted only to static pushing air, why reassign entire corporate teams and vault away the diagrams? The absence becomes its own form of presence. Every unsaid word to those watching carried as much meaning as the predictions erased from newspapers. By the end of the decade, the language of electrogravitics dissolved from respectable journals. Universities that had once hosted small conferences on gravity anomalies turned toward safer ventures in plasma physics and nuclear propulsion. Departments that had entertained graduate studies in alternative propulsion closed those paths entirely. The vocabulary itself receded. Terms like field-propelled craft and electrogravitic drive vanished from indexed catalogues, leaving only traces in the margins of bound pamphlets. The effect resembled a cultural erasure, as though the decade of speculation had embarrassed the establishment into collective forgetting. Yet believers viewed the absences differently. The more the world stopped talking, the more certain they became that conversations continued behind closed doors. The Cold War atmosphere made such secrecy plausible. Black budgets absorbed everything promising, dividing information into compartments labelled only for those who needed to know. A scientist could spend a career refining an effect without ever understanding its larger context, while another team in a different facility tested prototypes in silence. The parallel worlds of visible and hidden science grew wider. In one, textbooks taught conventional physics, reminding students that gravity bends for nothing short of mass itself. In another, if believers are to be trusted, engineers pressed Brown's concepts toward practical machines, flights conducted under desert skies that would never appear in public records. The paradox becomes sharp here. Either Brown's work truly represented a dead end, slowly abandoned once its flaws were clear, or it was absorbed into classified programs that built upon his breakthroughs but left no open acknowledgement. Both explanations match the silence. Both explain why conferences dried up, patents froze, and Brown himself faded into partial obscurity. The result is a vacuum, where absence invites projection, and projection grows into myth. Brown, the boy from Zanesville who bent foil caps with voltage, stands now halfway between historical figure and shadowed emblem of hidden progress. Imagine opening those drawers in a basement archive of the Navy. Paper brittle, diagrams faded, annotations in pencil still visible beside government stamps. Some would see harmless engineering curiosities. Others would see the foundation stones of technologies withheld for decades. Without the key, the meaning of the silence remains suspended. Believers lean in, pointing out that absence itself becomes too tidy to dismiss. Critics shake their heads, reminding anyone who listens that what vanishes without results usually deserves its burial. Between the two, the mystery grows stronger, precisely because the trail ends where the vault closes. So the 1950s closed not with revelation but with erasure. Brown's electrogravitics either passed into forgetfulness as a misunderstood phenomenon, or it passed through doors locked by classification, where it might still ripple in hidden laboratories. The boardroom of 1958, with its suits and smoke and manila folders, becomes the hinge of history. Beyond that door stretches only speculation. What survived in the open world were fragments, rumours and diagrams scattered through conspiracy circles. What survived in hidden rooms may remain unknown, perhaps advanced quietly into shapes that hover above night skies even now. The vaults closed, the files disappeared, and silence became louder than any lingering hum of capacitors from Brown's fragile machines. The summer of 1952 carried a strange electricity across the Midwest. Picture yourself standing in an Illinois wheat field, rows of gold stretching like a woven carpet into the horizon. The air is constant with the faint whine of insects, a chorus of crickets softened by dusk. Then comes the change. A glow rises just above the field's edge. No roar of engines, no beating of blades, only a disc-shaped presence 30 feet above the stalks. It moves without tremor, balanced in the air as though gravity itself had loosened its grip. Witnesses speak of the glow having no source, a soft, pale light settling downward over the wheat like moonlight in suspension. For farmers who watched from their porches, the machine was silent enough to unsettle the night's natural rhythms. Dogs fell quiet. The wind softened. Even the pulse of the crickets seemed to falter as the disc hovered in place before darting away faster than any plane they knew. In those very years when Townsend Brown's patents were retreating into vaults, the sky itself appeared to take up the missing conversation. Reports spiked. Lights over Washington. Discs trailing Air Force jets at supersonic speed. Silent craft gliding above reservoirs. This was not just an American curiosity. Reports echoed in France, Sweden, Chile. Each carried descriptions consistent enough to suggest a pattern, yet strange enough to resist dismissal. The public grew restless with these sightings, while at the same time the record of Brown's work became quieter than ever. A peculiar symmetry emerged. The moment one voice fell silent, the skies seemed to grow eloquent. What struck many observers was the detail. Witnesses did not simply describe lights in the sky, but vehicles with structure, discs that shifted from hover to acceleration in ways no known craft could match. Some reports spoke of faint coronas at the edges, the blue shimmer that trailed along the rim of the object like St. Elmo's fire wrapping a mast at sea. Others described sudden right-angle turns that left pilots gaping, convinced inertia alone should have torn the craft apart. The language matched Brown's laboratory behaviours almost too closely. Silent operation, drifting start, sharp movement into impossible flight paths. The question arose quietly. Was this coincidence or continuity? A Navy pilot recounted one such incident in 1954. His jet picked up a metallic disc on radar and closed to visual range. Against cloud banks coloured by sunset, he saw the object steady for a moment, reflective and strangely matte at the same time, before snapping upward with a burst of velocity that left instruments blinking. The pilot would later confide, not in official reports but in private conversations, that the craft's glide resembled the silent propulsion he had once seen in a demonstration years earlier. Some whisper this was a reference to Brown's capacitors, still fresh in his mind. To the pilot, watching a machine zip out of reach without noise or exhaust felt eerily similar to the tethered discs that had puzzled him in a naval lab chamber. Official accounts logged the sighting as unresolved. In the years following, UFO researchers began combing archives for patents, tracing filings to Brown's name. They noticed the shapes, discs, triangles, electrostatic thrusters positioned on curved surfaces. The terminology felt familiar. Talk of field propulsion, of forces acting without moving parts. Against the reports in newspapers of gliding saucers, the fit seemed too neat. Supporters suggest that these encounters were not evidence of extraterrestrial technology, but rather demonstrations of the same effect that Brown claimed decades earlier. Others dismiss it as wishful thinking, pointing instead to common misidentifications. Yet the echo remained. The very words used in mechanics papers began aligning with the language of eyewitness accounts. Within those circles, a theory took root. What if these were not visitors from other galaxies, but test flights of craft born in the back rooms of American laboratories? The Illinois farmer watching a glow above his crops might not have seen aliens at all. But perhaps the embryonic stage of electrogravitic craft pushed skyward by military engineers. If Brown's patents had sunk into silence in public records, perhaps they resurfaced as instructions whispered within classified projects. The mounting sightings were interpreted, by believers at least, as evidence that the work had not vanished but moved into another realm, shielded from disclosure. But the tension did not stop there, for the enigma carried a double reading. Some argued the opposite, that Brown had accidentally explained alien propulsion, providing language to describe sightings that truly were extraterrestrial. A silent gliding saucer after all matched both narratives, one of human technology advancing in shadows, and another of beings unimaginably beyond. The ambiguity only deepened the mystery. Either way, Brown's theoretical fingerprints fit the moulds left behind by unclassified reports. Science dismissed him, yet the skies seemed to stage his demonstrations on a grander scale. Most unsettling were the clusters of reports near military installations. Discs hovering over storage depots, oval lights pacing nuclear bombers on training flights, triangles circling proving grounds before slipping into upper air. These accounts felt less like random visitations and more like reconnaissance by machines whose pilots, whether foreign, domestic or other, operated with impunity. To many observers, the behaviour suggested advanced human craft. They pointed to the Cold War context. Battles for strategic edge fought not just on land or sea, but through physics itself. To others, alien presence seemed the simpler explanation. Yet no matter which lens was used, Townsend Brown's capacitors haunted the conversation. Imagine standing in that field in Illinois again, the stalks brushing against your legs in the evening breeze. You look upward and watch a pale disk hover, its rim glowing faintly blue. The movement recalls the quiet drift of foil capacitors on thin wires, little machines tilting toward their electrodes in a lab almost 30 years earlier. From the basement in Ohio to the skies above farm country, the imagery is linked by a single thread of electric hum. Some whisper the connection is deliberate, that the flying saucers of the 1950s are the full-grown offspring of Brown's teenage experiments. Others counter that humans simply project known marvels onto unknown lights. Yet for the witness, the resemblance would linger long after the glow sank beneath the horizon. By the mid-1950s, Project Blue Book attempted to contain the rising tide of reports. Thousands of files passed across military desks, each tagging a sighting as explained or unexplained. Hundreds resisted solution. The official tone denied extraterrestrial technology, attributing most cases to balloons, aircraft, even weather phenomena. Still, the unresolved core allowed fascination to endure. Within this gap, Brown's story slid neatly into place. To those loyal to his vision, every unexplained file felt like indirect evidence of electrogravitics operating under secrecy. Silence was seen not as negation, but as confirmation. The persistence of these beliefs carried forward for decades. Roswell, though explained as a balloon program, ignited speculation that alien wreckage validated Brown's theories. Aerospace whispers linked stealth bombers to electrostatic effects along their wings, surfacing claims that Brown's insight into coupling electricity with inertia had not been abandoned at all. If mainstream science dismissed him with the language of ion wind, hidden laboratories seemed to test his hum against the edge of higher skies. Each new sighting, every grainy photograph, wound his name deeper into UFO culture until his identity blurred between scientist and myth. The beauty of the paradox is how both readings continue to thrive. If the discs were extraterrestrial, Brown had given humanity the vocabulary to imagine their engines. If they were human prototypes, his capacitors were the quiet origin. Either conclusion positions his work at the crossroads of our greatest mystery. The image of a teenager in a damp basement shares space with the distant gleam of mechanized stars above cornfields. The faint corona linking them is neither fully explained nor forgotten. Today, when historians revisit the period, they find that the sharp convergence of dates cannot be ignored. Brown's patents fell silent. UFO reports surged. Aerospace corporations filed and withdrew claims about electrogravitics. Against the backdrop of Cold War secrecy, this intersection became a breeding ground for the belief that something significant had slipped behind classified walls. To the ordinary witness out in a field, the speculation hardly mattered. They only knew they saw a machine move in ways their world did not permit, silent under a glowing edge of light. It is in these quiet, personal accounts that Brown's myth gains its most human touch. A farmer stumbling in the glow of stalks, a pilot squinting against sunset clouds, a radar operator staring at a point moving too fast to be natural, all left with memories that resisted neat explanation. Their words may vary, their certainty may differ, but the descriptions rhyme with the motions recorded in Brown's notes. Whether explained as mundane air currents or extraordinary breakthroughs, the echoes continue, they refuse easy dismissal, and so we return to that question suspended in the still air of 1952. Did those hovering discs belong to us, born from forgotten laboratories, or to another intelligence altogether? Was the glow above a wheat field in Illinois a visitation across light years, or simply the first generation of human craft testing propulsion, born of electricity and gravity joined? Brown, absent from public life by then, could not answer. Yet the mystery of his basement seemed to have stepped into the sky itself, carrying with it the weight of secrecy, the pull of speculation, and the quiet awe of unanswered witness. The pastures fell quiet again after the craft departed, leaving only bent wheat and unsettled memory. But long after the stalk straightened, the echoes of that pale disk remained in the collective imagination. Brown had placed himself, perhaps unwittingly, at the very intersection where theories of suppressed technology and stories of alien visitation intertwine. It is there, in that crossroads between sky and shadow, where his legacy continues to vibrate. Neither confirmed nor erased, it hangs suspended, like a disk in the evening air, lit from within, waiting to accelerate into the unknown. The office air in Washington, 1962, carried the taste of stale tobacco and pressed paper, the sort of atmosphere that seemed made to choke out sunlight. Venetian blinds sliced the afternoon glow into narrow grey bars across the long mahogany table. A dozen men in near-identical grey suits leaned forward in unison, their elbows leaving faint smudges on polished surfaces. On the tabletop, Townsend Brown's patent diagrams spread corner to corner like oversized playing cards. The pages, fragile in the manner of onion skin copies, curled toward the smoke drifting lazily above them. For these officials, the sketches were less mechanical blueprints than symbols of possibility, hints that a force as ordinary as voltage could be reshaped into something that bent the very rules of nature. Across the room, the silence stretched, broken only by the creak of a chair and the faint whistle from a radiator. Every line on those sheets carried weight, the air thick as though each word was under a review by an invisible court. No chalkboard formulas filled this room, no open seminar or faculty office chatter. Brown had moved far beyond the familiar sound of coils buzzing in public auditoriums. He was no longer introduced as an inventor explaining mysterious hovering discs. His name now slipped instead through corridors where people spoke in clipped phrases, where memos carried more red stamps than signatures. In these spaces, his discoveries were counted not as science, but as potential instruments of state policy. His reputation among colleagues had cooled into skepticism, yet here that same work was picked apart in the quiet grammar of security classification. And so, while science journals moved on toward newer problems, Brown himself was absorbed by networks whose business was less about discovery and more about advantage. A different image sharpens into view, the hollow echo of boarding steps outside a TWA aircraft, Brown himself ascending into the steel body of a transatlantic jet. His briefcase sat chained against his wrist, an object that seemed almost heavier than the man himself. The polished lock on the cuff reflected the overhead lights as he handed his passport to a waiting official. Its cover carried diplomatic seals, elaborate and unmistakable, each one strong enough to make customs officers glance aside rather than open the case. Behind him, passengers shuffled with pouches and handbags. For them, the flight meant holiday photographs and business contracts. For him, it was a movement across corridors unseen, a transfer not of luggage but of responsibility. His travel, once spontaneous, now followed patterns traced not by curiosity but by orders, invisible yet binding. Arriving in London, Brown stepped into a different theatre of secrecy. Hotel rooms carried phones that clicked unnervingly just before the dial tone arrived. A conversation in a restaurant always seemed to reach the wrong ears. Menus became less important than glances over shoulders. The letters he had once written with ease grew shorter and more cautious. Even his handwriting, remarked upon by some who saw it, seemed to tighten. The looping flourishes reduced into straight and hurried lines. With each passing month, the sense of watchfulness increased. Those around him could feel it too. The unease of speaking in any place that could not be carefully checked for listening wires. Surveillance seeped into his routine until even breakfast felt staged within a theatre of suspicion. The circuit expanded beyond England. In shadowed basements of Whitehall, Brown was said to meet groups of British Admiralty researchers still grappling with post-war naval modernisation. The rooms smelled of damp stone, corridors lined with reminders of centuries-old traditions, yet there they sat, studying small devices that seemed pulled from science fiction headlines. Far across the Channel, French military scientists received his demonstrations in bunkers outside Normandy, places still scarred with shell craters and reinforced with concrete left behind by the war. One could imagine the echo of trucks above ground mixing with the hum of his equipment below. These experiences were not grand international conferences with banners and published papers, but rather hushed gatherings, tables surrounded by men whose uniforms spoke clearly of their priorities. All the while, fragments of his private communications seeped outward. A letter to his daughter, brief and enigmatic, referred to work of extreme military importance. Another to a colleague hinted at restrictions so strong that his movements had ceased to be his own. Each fragment suggested a man repositioned, bound by responsibilities heavier than personal ambition. Whatever joyous curiosity had once guided his basement trials now bent under the weight of loyalty, or fear, or perhaps both. To some, it appeared as evidence that he acted willingly as a patriot. To others, it revealed a figure caught in webs stronger than any consent he could grant. The ambiguity survives in the gaps. Did he choose to follow the current, or was he carried by it? If so many patents whispered of breakthrough propulsion, why were they missing from public archives? Why did Navy records leap across entire years without mention of experiments once loudly predicted to render jet engines obsolete? Some whisper that this very absence signals success, hidden away for protection. Others dismiss those silences as failures tucked discreetly out of sight. But no matter which interpretation, the uncertainty turned his history into an unresolved thread, stretched between pride and containment. Redacted reports emerged from intelligence bodies, budgets that included projects unnamed yet fit into the same chronological window as Brown's travels. Papers sometimes replaced his name with blank spaces, as though the syllables themselves required protective custody. In the culture of Cold War secrecy, those blanks attracted speculation, as a candle attracts moths. And while the Office of Naval Research maintained its own guarded files, other agencies, the CIA among them, had already demonstrated an appetite for evaluating unusual aerial phenomena. Viewed from today, it becomes difficult to separate their interest in exotic craft from their interest in the human inventor whose work brushed near those same mysteries. Attention also turned to the industrial stage, where companies like Lockheed, Martin, and Douglas had once poured resources into electrogravitics. Their silence in the later decades mirrored the quiet that wrapped around Brown. Critics counter that corporations cut funding when results disappointed. Supporters suggest that every promising trace was absorbed into streams of classified funding, transferred beyond view. Locked filing drawers swallowed diagrams, conferences closed their sessions, and published research retreated into the familiar stability of combustion engines and rocket propellants. Yet in the smaller compartmentalized rooms, information may have continued to pulse forward. Brown's association stretched even further. Some accounts connect him to private intelligence networks, shadow groups with financial ties to industrialists who prefer to work beyond both universities and government agencies. Such networks might have provided him both resources and yet another layer of obscurity. If accurate, it hints that his research was less an isolated pursuit and more an element in a chain of overlapping interests, part science experiment, part intelligence project, part geopolitical wager. For the man at the centre, each connection likely blurred together until ordinary choices, accepting a ticket, mailing a letter, belonged more to a system than to an individual. Meanwhile, he surfaced near major global initiatives. During the International Geophysical Year in the late 1950s, a worldwide collaborative project of science, Brown participated in ways that intersected with intelligence collection. Some suggest that his positioning allowed him to gather information, even related to U-2 overflights, weaving his scientific persona with covert obligations. If this was true, it revealed the depth of entanglement. Brown not merely inventor or theorist, but a participant in the constant balancing act between open research and closed surveillance. Consider the transformation. In less than 2 decades, he had travelled from a damp Ohio basement filled with humming coils to a place where his diagrams passed as classified currency. For the public, he dropped from view. No more civic lectures, no more demonstrations that mirrored flying saucer headlines. Instead, quiet flights abroad, unknown budgets, and conversations muffled enough that even in memory they hold little sound. From science to statecraft, from curiosity to control. By the early 1960s, his life had entered a veil so heavy that even conspiracy theorists often find themselves struggling to push past it. The public persona, eccentric inventor with foil discs and humming capacitors, remains accessible, easily described. But the man seated in windowless rooms, his diagrams laid in rows before intelligence officials, belongs to a different register, one harder to narrate because it exists primarily in gaps, in silences, in what can only be guessed. It opens a wider question. When a discovery collides with national interest, does it still belong to science at all? Or does it dissolve into holdings only measured by power? The lights of the boardroom glow cold and steady, washing polished mahogany in pale fluorescence. It is 2008, and the hour is late enough that shadows stretch long across the floor, yet the table is crowded. Patent diagrams lie scattered in faintly glowing sheets from the copier, edges curling like cards from another world. A Boeing engineer slides one across the surface toward a pair of defense contractors. The sketch shows the sweeping outline of a triangular craft, the angles precise, the curves unfamiliar. They lean forward in silence, tracing lines they have seen before, not in the open sky, but folded away in classified memories belonging to decades past. Each stroke recalls something unsettling. The geometry draws its descent not from modern codes, but from designs that can be tracked back to copper coils in a damp Ohio basement. The atmosphere carries the hushed language of familiarity. Nobody in the room needs reminding that half a century earlier, Townsend Brown claimed the force of electric fields could harness gravity itself. His claims had seemed outlandish, drawn upon the margins of science rather than its centre. Yet here was Boeing reviving the same asymmetric capacitor designs in 2006. The patent's words echo phrases first uttered by Brown, only now delivered through the greater authority of a corporate application. The term electro-aerodynamic propulsion rings strangely similar to what once passed under the quieter description of the Biefeld-Brown effect. Critics can dismiss Brown's experiments as atmospheric quirks, but the diagrams spread across these long tables repeat his signatures with uncanny loyalty. Several years before that boardroom moment, whispers had circulated about a project within BAE Systems. Its name, Project Greenglow, suggested something small, obscure, almost playful, yet the details of its leaked documents gave it more weight. Gravity modification research, conducted with quiet caution, appeared in the language of those reports. Engineers described high-voltage capacitors being tested in concealed laboratories, their stated objective plain, attempting to address the very mystery Brown had spent a lifetime pursuing. Executives, laced with evasive words and nervous confidence, wondered aloud if this could be a genuine path to propulsion beyond jet engines. Though public science had long since eliminated such ambitions from its curriculum, corporate memory seemed unwilling to fully let go of the spark that had formed decades earlier in that damp Ohio cellar. The patent trail forms its own strange paper map through the 21st century. Boeing filed designs under the title Electro-Aerodynamic Propulsion, listing arrays of asymmetric capacitors capable of pushing air without moving parts. Lockheed Martin added filings that referenced field-coupled surface-travelling wave systems. Each phrase represented a slightly disguised restatement of what Brown once called electrogravitics. The diagrams themselves struck an uncanny chord. Bars, plates, asymmetric layouts meant to generate thrust without fire or turbine. If viewed beside Brown's original sketches from the 1950s, the echo is undeniable. His tinkering coils appear to have been translated out of the basement and etched into modern aerospace projects. Even if publicly dismissed, the lineage remained visible, encoded in the language of patents. Yet outside these fluorescent rooms, a parallel theatre unfolded. Online communities produced their own experiments, filmed with handheld cameras and kitchen equipment. Aluminum foil, balsa wood, wires, all assembled into small craft known as lifters. A simple charge running through the arrangement produced movement, sometimes eerie hover, often filmed against bedroom walls or garage ceilings. In those shaky YouTube videos, purple-blue corona glow filled the frame. The effect looked precisely like what Brown once saw on delicate foil discs drifting across his basement wires. Millions watched. Some whispered it was proof of suppressed technology, first glimpsed in the 1920s, kept from the public since the Cold War. Others called it nothing more than ion wind. The rushing of charged air molecules pushing against the foil. The same evidence proved two different worlds depending on who looked. One viral video still circulates in memory. A small lifter made of aluminum strips hangs above a kitchen table. A smartphone camera catches its faint lift. The hum is barely audible over the buzz of the recording. Comments crowd beneath the video. One voice insists this is simple physics taught in graduate labs. Another asks whether such craft are used in the black projects rumoured at certain Air Force bases. Believers cite Brown. Skeptics counter with aerodynamic equations. The split is clear, neither side fully rescinding its claim, neither side able to end the debate. The lifter rises, drifts, and remains caught in this dispute as suspended as the foil itself. The claims continue into stranger terrain. Among conspiracy communities, talk often turns to the TR-3B, an aircraft whispered into existence without official recognition. Accounts describe black triangles gliding across night skies near military bases. No engine noise, only a faint glowing field along their edges. Some viewers describe soft blue light along the underside, matching the visual effect of corona discharge that emerges when high voltage capacitors run under strain. For others, the shape recalls nothing less than Brown's early asymmetric designs brought to larger scale, matured into fully operational machines. Skeptics call it misidentified conventional aircraft. But for those familiar with the history, the overlap feels hard to ignore. NASA too appears in this pattern. Researchers have tested variations of asymmetric capacitors in vacuum chambers. Their stated purpose rarely mentions Brown outright. Instead, the papers refer to terms like electrokinetic thrust or electro-aerodynamic motion. Yet the diagrams repeat the same asymmetric forms. A 2004 NASA patent describing a barrel-shaped capacitor hints in many ways at Brown's older sketches, though presented through the safer language of ionic propulsion. By avoiding his name, the documents appear cautious, perhaps unwilling to tread near claims too saturated with conspiracies. Still, the shadow remains there. The language, voltage levels, and geometry point back to experiments from decades before. Project Greenglow, the Boeing filings, the Lockheed references, each shows how aerospace giants never truly closed the file, even while mainstream academia adopted silence. It creates a puzzle. If Brown's work is only ion wind, why maintain such hidden fascination? Why describe technology in terms so close to his once marginalized patents? Others counter with a simple claim. Engineers see potential in electrical propulsion that has nothing to do with anti-gravity. The similarities, they say, are coincidence born of physics itself. But the echoes render coincidence harder to separate. Conversation also circles the B-2 stealth bomber. Rumours emerge that its performance derives in part from electrostatic effects along its wing edges, negatively charged trailing surfaces and positively charged leading surfaces meant to harness, in small ways, the effect Brown theorised. Officials have never confirmed such claims, yet the concept aligns with patterns of secrecy common in Cold War programs. revolutionary technologies integrated quietly, never acknowledged, hidden as defense advantage. If true, Brown's presence would linger even in one of the most iconic aircraft of modern war. But the record falls mute, leaving little more than speculation and scattered hints. The tension deepens when viewed against human scenes. An engineer in a garage leans over his lifter, wires draped across a concrete floor, hearing only the faint hiss of current. Across the ocean, a corporate representative slides technical diagrams to a defense committee under fluorescent lights. Between them lies half a century of secrecy, accusation, and forgotten claims. Both bricolage and bureaucracy recall the same asymmetry, the same tilted capacitor plates that might push against air or something more. The ordinary hand that tapes foil to balsa wood, and the corporate hand that signs patent papers, move in strange parallel arcs, mirroring Brown's original trembling adjustments on brass dials. Even the debates from skeptics preserve the paradox. They argue, ion wind as mechanism is well understood, it cannot propel in a vacuum. Yet questions persist because hobbyists reproduce the effect with such simplicity that it feels like a gateway to something more. Supporters repeat the argument that if it were so trivial, if it truly held no larger possibilities, entire aerospace giants would never return to the form. They would not invest research hours nor patent designs based on it. The disagreement itself becomes the story, and the story refuses to fade. There is something uncanny about watching patterns echo through decades without change. Townsend Brown scribbled his designs under weak basement light, dust rising, thin discs gliding across wires. Boeing decades later sketches triangular craft pushing against fields. Lockheed lists travelling waves on capacitor surfaces. NASA mentions asymmetric arrays in vacuum studies. Hobbyists watch foil frames raise above a table. Witnesses swear at the sight of triangles hovering over rural highways. Across these differences, the geometry holds. It repeats like a design seeded inside the culture of flight, resurfacing even when denied, persisting even when dismissed. Some whisper that the survival of these forms through patent after patent shows more than curiosity, that the real technology was integrated long ago, leaving only hints behind. Others dismiss such claims, arguing that the physics remains bound by atmosphere, never achieving thrust in deeper space, never amounting to revolutionary utility. At the crossroads lies Brown's legacy, revolutionary discovery or self-sustaining delusion. Yet, what keeps his fingerprints visible even now is less physics than persistence. His anomaly refuses to evaporate. The convergence of modern test results, patents, and sighting reports sharpens the paradox. If the effect is atmospheric, the technical fascination seems excessive. If it represents breakthrough propulsion, its absence from public transportation seems conspicuous. The longer the ambiguity remains, the more the mystery grows. It proves extraordinarily difficult to erase an idea when corporations, militaries, and garage tinkerers all continue sketching it. Silence stretches between them, but the echo is undeniable. As the fluorescent hum fades in that 2008 boardroom, the tarot-like spread of patent diagrams remains on the mahogany table. Triangles sweep across paper, engineers adjust glasses, take notes, leave without fanfare. In garages and online spaces, cameras continue to record drifting foil craft with grains of blue light. In dark skies near restricted bases, distant witnesses describe hovering triangles. Each fragment threads back to a boy's trembling experiment in Ohio. And the story asks the same unresolved question. If these echoes are only minor forces of air and charge, why do they endure across decades of secrecy? And if they point towards something grander, why does it remain hidden, glimpsed only through patents, rumours, and fading light? Chalk dust clings to the air of an MIT classroom. Equations wind across blackboards in neat slanted rows, symbols nested inside symbols until the whole surface feels like a tangled diagram of forces no one fully sees. A professor leans into the board with his sleeve, erasing a set of lines that carried Townsend Brown's name years ago. To him, the equation's a ghost not worth keeping. Brown is reduced to an afterthought, another tinkerer who misread the movement of air for something grander, his theories dismissed as a mistake too embarrassing to linger much longer in neat, academic memory. The board shines clean again. What was once written now, nothing more than chalk dust drifted across linoleum. Far away in another time, fluorescent bulbs hum above a faded hotel conference room. There's no chalk here, only a stack of photocopied patents curling under the heat. Men in worn suits lean close, pages spread across thin tables. One lowers his voice to describe what he once saw while working under defense contracts. Demonstrations hidden by stamps and vault doors, craft that shifted without wings, propulsion that echoed patterns from Brown's earlier sketches. His listeners nod, pens ready, as though each photocopy is evidence of a truth nobody else dares to say out loud. In this low-lit place, Brown is not a forgotten experimenter. Here, he is a pioneer suppressed by institutions, the father of technologies pushed into shadow. The contradiction forms its own stage. In bright classrooms, his name is something to erase, an example of error bold enough to warn students about mixing curiosity with fancy. In these cramped community halls, his name carries weight. Brown is treated as the seed from which hidden fleets of craft might grow. Both spaces build from the same man, the same experiments with capacitors under high voltage. Both tell stories of foil discs and quiet demonstrations. Yet what those events meant fractures down two incompatible paths. Critics identify ion wind, nothing more than charged particles colliding with neutral air to generate lift measurable and ordinary. Supporters suggest it was electrogravitics, the direct manipulation of mass, inertia, perhaps even time. The same evidence lives in this split reality. A Navy test where his devices fail to lift in vacuum chambers proves dismissal in academic circles. To others, the very same test is treated as a deliberate cover-up, a staged outcome meant to shield the real results hidden elsewhere. Reports of corona discharge tingling across brass assemblies become, depending on who interprets them, either the mundane glow of ionization or the threshold of humanity's first steps away from Newton's gravity. There is no separate evidence for each side. Both camps touch the same data and simply choose which meaning to keep. Testimonies sharpen the contrast further. Nobel laureates shake their heads when Brown's name enters a conversation, marking his work as impossible claims that should have been let go by the 1950s. Yet in private conversations, seasoned aerospace engineers admit the mathematics in his notebooks contain traces of something strange, not easily dismissed with simple explanations. Some recall classified projects where capacitor arrays humming under voltage produced effects that could not be comfortably written off as wind in air. These confessions rarely left notes behind, drifting instead as whispers through rumour and memory. Institutional records themselves carry the contradiction. University archives from Brown's early associations lose entire chunks of correspondence. Boxes that should carry his discussions with mentors or partners sit thin inside storage vaults, years missing. Defense contractors, when pressed for details, produce no official record of dedicated research into electrogravitics. File drawers stand empty, reports absent, the paper trail cut short. Yet in underground networks, entire collections of patents, photographs, and lecture notes circulate. Mimeographed pages carry diagrams like sacred texts. Bound photocopies of Brown's writings shift hands at conventions. Wherever silence establishes itself in academic or military halls, a shadow archive fills in the absence. Sometimes what's missing tells the louder story. This years-long unresolved argument leaves Brown hovering in a peculiar position. He exists both as a man who got it wrong and as a man who uncovered too much. Neither version can displace the other entirely. The stalemate endures because the contradiction resists easy closure. If he had been fully useless, his designs likely would not appear in corporate patents filed decades later. If he had touched genuine breakthrough physics, the world's skies would likely look different by now. And yet neither end of that spectrum holds uncontested ground. The result is a paradox, not simply about physics, but about how institutions remember and forget. For some believers, Brown's timeline resembles myth more than science. A boy in a damp Ohio basement touches forbidden forces, spends a lifetime misunderstood, and is swallowed by secrecy while his inventions rise in hidden fleets. Critics, in contrast, position him as a cautionary tale against enthusiasm leaping beyond data. The one thing both camps agree on is that his story endures long after his failed or forgotten devices should have faded. That persistence itself is striking. Without definitive replication, without scientific consensus, his work remains alive in imagination and in speculation. The persistence may stem from something human in the story. An amateur who believed he had bent gravity, defying universities that closed their doors. A man submitting patents that never blossomed into products but still drew classified attention. A tinkerer turned into a legend by accident of timing and secrecy. Failures become martyrdom in some circles, silence becomes proof in others. It is precisely the ambiguity, the unfinished nature of the record that allows the myth to spread. One lecture hall wipes his chalk away, a hotel ballroom whispers over his patents. Both rooms keep the paradox steady, as though the contradiction itself is his invention more lasting than any gravitator. Around the world, eager hands still tape foil to wooden sticks, building tabletop lifters. Aerospace boards still quietly file patents with concepts nearly identical to those lifters. Neither admits heritage, yet the outlines remain. It creates an endless parallel. Mainstream physicists raise eyebrows and let silence close in, while conspiracy conferences hold Brown's name in reverence. The man belongs neither entirely to textbooks nor entirely to myth. He is instead a ghost suspended between both. This suspension grants a kind of immortality. Brown does not rest as a simple failure, forgotten beneath new equations, nor does he rest as a fully accepted pioneer. He exists in perpetual conflict, appearing credible enough to inspire serious patents, yet fringe enough to be marked delusion by academic presses. That between places become his legacy. Few scientific figures find themselves so permanently stuck between dismissal and vindication, present in two realities at once like overlapping projections. Decades after his death, his name still divides rooms. In lecture halls it falls as a caution, the story of how bright minds can misinterpret electric effects. In hotel basements it rises like scripture, the testimony of a silenced prophet. The contradiction grinds on with neither side closing the argument. Sometimes the stalemate itself is the story, and it shows every sign of lasting far longer than those first basement discs ever floated. What lingers in this duality is not simply what Townsend Brown may or may not have achieved, but what humanity does with uncertainty. We preserve it, argue through it, keep it alive with whispers and erasures. His paradox became a mirror reflecting our own tension between skepticism and longing. And as long as equations keep disappearing from chalkboards while photocopied patents pass hand to hand, that tension, and Brown's blurred figure within it, will not dissolve. The paradox endures, waiting quietly as the story edges toward its final echo. The basement stands unchanged in its bones, yet time has claimed its spirit. The air holds that faint metallic bite of ozone, though no coil has crackled here for decades. Dust drifts quietly across shelves where wires coil lifeless and glass tubes lean at lazy angles. In the quiet light of morning, the floor carries faint outlines where equipment once pressed heavy against concrete. It is 2024, and the room hums only in memory. The walls, patched with moisture stains, seem to remember the currents that once ran through them. as if their stones still vibrate with secrets sealed away before the last dial was touched. Townsend Brown's journey threads out from this small basement. He began here, barely more than a boy, in pursuit of a ripple beneath ordinary laws of nature. He ended 70 years later in quiet obscurity, his name omitted from formal textbooks yet stubbornly alive in the pages of UFO lore and in patents filed under aerospace giants. The irony is heavy. Nothing of his life ended with certainty. His claim of electricity bending gravity hung unresolved. Critics still describe shifting air, calling it no more than ion drift. Supporters imagine gravitational manipulation rushed into dark projects, placed under seals he never saw. Both tellings circle the same figure, an inventive spirit that found something strange and would not let it go. What unsettles listeners most is not whether Brown succeeded, but the scale of what his story implies. Did he mistake the movement of charged air for a cosmic breakthrough and build his life around that illusion? That possibility feels tragic but believable. Yet the other likelihood carries weight as well, that he glimpsed a true field effect that cut into gravity's core, something extraordinary, and that the discovery entered the realm of classification. Either explanation keeps unease alive, failure explains persistence, success explains silence. Neither untangles the paradox of how a basement experiment could ripple outward into suspicion, secrecy, and legend. Brown's tale reflects deeper truths about our uneasy bond with breakthrough science. We dream of flight stripped of wings, silent vehicles cutting through clouds without fuel flame, machines bending forces unseen. But institutions answer dreams with their own survival. Secrecy wrapped in stamps, knowledge shaped into advantage, discoveries rationed by hierarchy. Breakthroughs that reach into dangerous possibilities shift quickly from laboratory bench to classified drawer. In that shift, the boundary between science and statecraft hardens. Brown's experiments were not simply tests of foil discs. They became a stage where human yearning for transcendence collided with bureaucratic instinct for control. The echoes of his life surface still. Aerospace patents across the late 20th and early 21st centuries repeat elements of his effect. Plates arranged with asymmetry, language shifting between inertial control and electro-aerodynamic propulsion. YouTube amplifies the smaller echoes, homemade lifters filmed against garage ceilings, blue halos flickering as current runs through foil and wire. These hobbyist demonstrations invite debate, comments alternately dismissing them as atmospheric play or celebrating them as glimpses of buried research. At the same time, whispers of classified field propulsion projects loop back into discussion. Each fragment keeps Brown's presence alive, refracted through public and hidden layers. What lingers across them all is the fear and hope inherent in suppressed discovery. How many other sparks ignited in workshops but dimmed before reaching the wider world? Eyes-only files mark more than information. They mark parallel timelines, patents buried, conferences cancelled, projects broken into compartments so narrow that even the scientists themselves may not understand the larger frame. Brown's case invites suspicion that he was only one glimpse, one thin slice, of a broader quiet archive where extraordinary physics might have been shelved, left to advance only in secret corridors. That suspicion leads to an unsettling vision of science unfolding on mismatched clocks. One tempo marches slow, through journals, classrooms, and textbooks teaching what is reliable. Another may run fast behind sealed doors years ahead, discovering, discarding, and weaponizing knowledge, while the public debates effects already surpassed. In this split, reality fragments. Citizens weigh decades-old rumours, while technologies glide unseen across skies. Even if Brown's disk never left his tethered wires, the outline of such division is visible, fueling the perception that knowledge is not shared equally, but filtered until deemed safe. and yet return to that first moment in Ohio. A teenager's nervous hand rested lightly on brass dials, pausing as the coil steadied its hum. The foil disc, suspended by a fragile wire, edged forward with improbable grace. Hair lifted along his arm, shadows shifted with the bulb's flicker. Whether it was only moving air or something greater, the scene carried a charge beyond the physical. A boy became tethered to fascination, to suspicion, to a lifetime of pursuit. That single glide shaped every echo that followed. The realization left to us is simple in phrasing but vast in meaning. Genuine or mistaken, Brown's life carried both elements equally. The persistence of his story draws less from final proof than from the human resonance it holds. Hope that the ordinary laws around us are not final, and suspicion that truths are managed like assets. This combination keeps his memory circling, generating light in both scholarly dismissal and conspiratorial reverence. That paradox is the gravity around his legacy. No one escapes it fully, so the question lingers. If a small coil in Ohio could spark a century of suspicion, where else might such sparks wait unseen? In how many basements long forgotten, inside laboratories lost to time, or buried inside classified archives have other inventors brushed close to forces capable of rewriting what we know? It is not the silence that unsettles most, but the possibility that those glances were real, and that we may never be permitted to see them